Well, yes, I'm Professor Brendan Walker. I'm a thrill engineer. I also run Thrill Laboratory, which is a collection of scientists, artists, designers, and engineers, all of who have a passion for creating and studying thrill rides. And I'm here at New Scientist Live with my friends at Middlesex University. I'll tell you a little bit more about what I'm up to with them towards the end. But I'm going to start with a rapid introduction to the science and art of thrill rides. Well, where better to begin than looking at a roller coaster? I like to think of a roller coaster as a factory machine that processes a material, humans, and adds a particular ingredient, thrill. Now, just like any other factory machine, like this one that's processing donuts, a thrill ride can be assessed for the efficiency with which it delivers thrill as an ingredient, just as this donut machine can be assessed for the efficiency it glazes its donuts. But there's a problem. Not all donuts are the same. They don't all like to be glazed in the same way. All donuts are quite different. And this is the same, leaving that donut analogy there, with people. These are 4 people I conducted an experiment on 10 years ago on Oblivion at Alton Towers. Has anybody been on Oblivion at Alton Towers? Oh yeah, quite a lot of you. So you know that drop, that sudden drop. I was interested to know, of the 100 people I was surveying, how they would respond to that very same drop. And I used a technique called psychometric profiling, and a particular psychometric profiling test which was developed by Professor Marvin Zuckerman at Delaware Tech in the States. His sensation-seeking scale was going to help me to understand the different psychological makeup of all of these riders and how they might potentially respond to that one particular ride feature, which was the world's first vertical drop. Here's just one of their reactions.
Okay, it's going to be all right. Don't look down. Oh!
Seems to have lost the sound. He screams very loudly, I can tell you that.
That was amazing!
This guy here was a roller coaster virgin. He'd never been on a roller coaster before. Now, Marvin Zuckerman's sensation-seeking scale is broken down into 4 different categories. The first category is the adventure and thrill-seeking scale. And if you answer these 10 questions, you get a score. Joe Walker, who is one of NASA's first supersonic test pilots, would have scored very high on the thrill and adventure-seeking scale. The second scale is experience-seeking scale. People who like to go to unusual theatre or crazy circus performances, they would score very high on the experience-seeking scale. The third scale is disinhibition, how likely you are to break out into spontaneous dance in a public space. You would score very high. And the fourth category to understanding rider types is the susceptibility to boredom. Basically, I mean, that's a very good one. If you're going to design a very popular ride, you want people to queue for hours before they get onto it. So science can help us to understand the personality types of people we're trying to thrill with our machine, our factory machine that delivers thrill. But it's an art, and it's something that fairground showmen have understood for hundreds of years. They've been watching their audience and designing fairground rides to be able to cater for all these different personality types. So now we start to get an idea of the complexity of designing rides for different types of people. Let's start to think about how we might actually start to design the ride itself. Well, let's look to science. Now, science describes thrill as exhilaration or excitement in response to novel stimuli. That doesn't really give us much of an indication of how to build a thrill ride, but let's think about it in terms of a GCSE science question. Imagine a body free-falling through space over a distance s1 under the influence of gravity, to be decelerated over a distance s2, and hopefully land safely at the bottom. So without a context, it doesn't sound very thrilling. So let's see how many different ways we can do this. How about something I did 8 years ago? Skydiving for the first time at a budget skydiving center in the USA, strapped to the chest of a South Korean flight instructor who didn't speak a word of English, hoping that he would communicate to me at 5,000 feet when the right time was to pull the ripcord. That was quite thrilling. How about a high diver in Acapulco, whose only technology is a pair of very small Speedo swimming trunks? And hopefully, if he survives being dashed against the rocks at the bottom, he'll get a rapturous applause from his audience and maybe a pina colada in the bar afterwards. This is a little bit more of a darker image. This is an actual photograph taken in 1947 of a woman jumping from a burning hotel in Atlanta, Georgia. She jumped from the 3rd floor. She only broke her 2 ankles. She survived. But this photograph was taken by a student photographer called Arnold Hardy. He only had 1 film left in his camera, 1 flashbulb left, and he caught this photograph, which went absolutely viral across the whole of the States in all of the newspapers. So this was very thrilling for him because he won the Pulitzer Prize, and also very thrilling for a much larger audience. So again, the same physics of somebody dropping under the effects of gravity, but lots of people being thrilled in very different ways. How about another hotel, the Tower of Terror in Disneyland Paris, where you climb inside a lift shaft, you plummet through all sorts of scenes of horror and terror and confronted with ghouls and ghosts. But this wasn't the first vertical drop thrill ride that appeared in Paris or was proposed for Paris. Just as Monsieur Eiffel was designing his tower, so too was Monsieur Caron designing the first vertical drop ride to be dropped from the center of Eiffel's tower. Now, passengers were going to be seated inside this torpedo-shaped container. They were sitting on sprung chairs, nice velvet chairs, and as they dropped through a distance from P to A, they would be decelerated very gradually, hopefully, by a champagne-shaped lake below. The ride was never built, and it's quite lucky because engineers since have shown that the deceleration forces on the passengers inside would have ensured that they would have come to a very sticky end. It would have been thrilling, but for a very short amount of time, and possibly only for these passengers. These kind of engineering calculations are things that I will occasionally get involved in. Alton Towers approached me with a question, a very specific question, when they were designing 13 Alton Towers. Those of you who've been on 13 know that when you go into the dark tunnel, you wait for a little while, and then you drop in the dark. Their question to me was, how far do we need to drop riders in the dark for it to be thrilling? Because if we make it too far, it costs tens of thousands of pounds to create new steelwork to support that drop. So it's a very important calculation. Get it too short, it's not going to be thrilling at all. And they didn't have a long amount of time for me to do this research. So I went to the Department of Transport looking for clues. I had a hunch. I was looking for evidence and research for how riders or drivers in motor cars would respond to danger. For example, a mother pushing a pram out in front of a car. How long did it take for a driver to recognize danger, to process that information, and to translate it into action, which would be pressing the brake pedal? It turns out for the 95th percentile, that's for 95% of the population, it would take about 0.7 seconds to recognize that danger. So by 0.7 seconds, 95% of us would recognize the danger. And then it would be 1.2 seconds to actually do something about it. Now, if you know your equations of motion, dropping somebody free fall under the effects of gravity, that's around 2.4 meters to recognize the danger, and around just over 7 meters to do something about it. And this doing something about it in the terms of a thrill ride is to start screaming and grab hold of the sides of your seats. That's what I wanted to get. That was the payoff for me. Now, anybody who's a bit of a ride nerd like me will know that 13, the drop feature is only 5 meters. Now, the way we shaved off an extra 2 meters was to do an initial drop of 30 centimeters. So the ride suddenly drops and doesn't go anywhere, and then it drops to 5 meters. And what that does in the brain, in psychological terms, it pump primes the brain and makes it aware and ready for the danger that's going to come. So using a mixture of psychology and engineering, we managed to save theme park manufacturers thousands of pounds. So now we know how to start creating thrilling experiences. How do we begin to think about their efficiency? So this is where I started looking at the emotions of riders. There's a very simple, basic model of emotions. And if you talk to psychologists, they'll say this is probably the simplest way to think about emotions. All emotions can be defined by 2 components. The amount of arousal it contains, that's when the body gets pumped up and ready for action. It's very much associated with adrenaline. And also the amount of valence it contains, and that's just the scientific term for pleasure, how much we like something or not. If you were to map out valence against arousal, that's pleasure against arousal, you can fit all human emotions on this graph, which is great. But it's only a snapshot in time. Human emotions are far more complicated. If you look at people's emotions over time, valence and arousal bounce around all the time. It's a very messy place. Now, I discovered when I was interviewing riders coming off roller coasters that they reported they were most thrilled when there was a rapid and large increase in valence and arousal together. And this formed the basis for the Walker thrill factor. What the Walker thrill factor says is you'll get greater amounts of thrill when there's a massive change in valence and arousal multiplied by a rapid change in valence and arousal. It's got to be big, it's got to be fast. But then there's another problem. This is probably the most complex diagram I'm going to show you. You can't sustain high levels of pleasure and arousal all the time. Because remember, to be thrilled, it's the movement of pleasure and arousal, maximizing it, that creates the sensation of thrill. So once you've hit that thrilling point, to create another thrilling moment, you have to drop people back down again. And that takes time. We're not machines. It takes time to create pleasure and arousal. And so, like this sawtooth wave diagram at the top, there's a theoretical maximum that we can actually experience thrill over time. Now, it just so happens using this theoretical maximum, I've been looking at lots of roller coasters around the UK and around the world, and it turns out that against this scale, people only use, or rather, theme park rides only usually achieve around a score of around 20% on the Walker thrill factor scale. Now, theme parks think that's appalling. That's a very low score. 20% thrill rating, terrible. But when you think about the thermal efficiency of some of the world's best combustion engines, their ability to turn chemical potential energy into useful mechanical power, they're around 20% as well. So I think theme parks aren't doing too badly turning potential energy into useful emotional energy. So I think it's a pretty good score. So now we know we're looking for 2 things, valence, or pleasure, and arousal. Is there a way to be able to monitor those and actually to be able to determine in real time a score for the Walker thrill factor? This is where I turn to another part of science, another discipline in science. It's called psychophysiology, which looks at how the body communicates or how the body responds to different emotional states. There's a system called the sympathetic nervous system inside the body, which when we become aroused, the sympathetic nervous system becomes activated, and that controls some key physiological factors. Our pupils become dilated, our hearts start to beat faster, our breathing becomes quickened. But also, our hands become clammy, our feet become a little bit sweaty as well. We share a really fascinating trait with some of our primate cousins. We have a higher concentration of sweat glands on our hands and our feet. When we become aroused, for example, when we're chasing prey or evading being eaten by a predator, we become a little bit clammy on our hands and feet. And for our primates, this is really important because it makes them a little bit stickier and able to grab hold of branches and swing away faster which obviously in evolutionary terms is pretty helpful. But for me, it's also a very useful factor because this electrodermal activity, to give it its scientific name, can be monitored. As the pores in the fingers open and close, the electrical resistance between them also changes, and actually changes in direct proportion to the amounts of arousal we're experiencing. So if you pass a small electrical signal through one finger and measure the current coming out of the other and try to determine the resistance, you can also determine the level of arousal that somebody is experiencing at any one time. And this is something I started talking to a scientist at MIT in Media Lab Europe, a scientist called James Condren, who is developing biosensors to be able to monitor these changes, these fluctuations in electrodermal activity. I said to him, let's make an auto-portrait machine. I was interested in making a machine that would fire a single-use camera with a single flash to take photographs of people's faces. And the camera would be triggered when there was a massive and large increase in arousal only, just looking at the electrodermal activity. I was interested in what people's expressions would be. I followed George Irvin's fairground around the southeast of England over a few months, taking photographs of people on different rides. Their facial expressions were really intriguing. There was a certain sense of mania going on when they were experiencing these high levels of arousal. Others were more classic delight and excitement. Others, euphoria and bliss. And some just sheer horror and terror. Now, the face is really intriguing, particularly when we start to think about trying to determine people's levels of pleasure or valence. There are 43 different muscle groups in the human face. As animals, and obviously Charles Darwin was the first to point out in the expressions of emotions in man and animals, we are all built to communicate emotions to each other. We're very social creatures. These 43 different muscle groups, when activated in different configurations, convey different emotions. I'm particularly interested in two different muscle groups. One's the corrugator supercilii, which is the muscle group above the eyes, which is the frown muscle, which shows and communicates our levels of displeasure, a kind of negative valence, and also the zygomaticus major, which are the smile muscles around the mouth, which are a good indicator of levels of pleasure. Scientists like Paul Ekman, during the 1970s, formalized this way of decoding the face with his facial action coding system. So you can look at a face and score each of the muscles and then determine what emotional states people are experiencing. Scientists more recently are using techniques called computer vision, where a computer will look at your face and track all the different muscle groups in your face and be able to determine live and in real time the different emotional states you're experiencing. I worked a few years ago with one of those scientists, Michel Valstar from the University of Nottingham, to create a system which, when used on a roller coaster, would be able to determine the emotional state of the riders. And I was asked Blue Peter to try it out for the first time. Here's Helen Skelton.
Right, okay, here goes. So we're going to what? This is the first
riding
7
Smiler at
leads.
Alton Towers.
Okay, here we go.
Oh, here goes!
Now, of course, Alton Towers were mainly concerned that the happy score was going to be particularly high, and it was 25%. They were delighted with that. And obviously, for TV, the face, people's facial expressions of emotions, a particularly useful thing to be able to portray. So over the last 10 years, I've been perfecting my equations for thrill, the ways I monitor thrill, looking at people's physiology. I've also been looking at neurology and how the brain reacts to thrilling experiences, and also developing techniques for looking at the face. I was asked by the BBC to conduct a review of all the theme park rides in the UK and to test some of the most likely contenders for those that might be the most thrilling in the UK. The one that won was quite surprising. It was this one here on the left. It's Rage at Southend-on-Sea in Adventure Island. Now, it's actually a ride type called a Eurofighter style ride. That's the kind of design. And it's made by a company called Gerstlauer. And it's exactly the same type of ride as the one that underpins Saw at Thorpe Park. In fact, Rage cost around £4 million. Saw cost about £13.5 million. If you want to try this ride, I'd still go to the one at Adventure Island. Now, the reason it scores so high, it isn't the fastest, it isn't the highest, but just look at how compact it is. And if you remember back to that graph I showed you earlier, it isn't just about that one moment, like on Oblivion, that just creates that single moment of thrill. It's about being able to do it time and time again, as quickly as possible. And if you can create a much more compact ride that does all these changes very quickly, you get all these changing acceleration forces that are going on through the twists and turns and loops, then you get a sustained thrill for a longer period of time. And that's exactly why Rage won. So now we know something about piecing together a whole ride from all these different components. How about we just focus on one particular ride feature, the loop-the-loop? In fact, the loop-the-loop was the name of the first loop-the-loop ride which appeared at Coney Island at the turn of the 20th century. It was thrilling. It worked, obviously. You would come hurtling down the slide towards the loop. As you entered into the loop, which in this case was almost a perfect circle, you would go hurtling around and out the other side. But there was a problem. People were becoming injured. In fact, people were becoming so injured on such a regular basis, there were nurses permanently stationed at this ride. And it was because as you enter into this circle, riders were experiencing up to 10G instantaneously. And that was causing head trauma and whiplash. So it was a great ride, but it was a little bit dangerous. Can we do it a little bit more safely? Can we create thrill using a loop-the-loop, but do something a little bit different to make it safer? I was asked by ITV, It's Not Rocket Science, if I could create the world's first human-powered inverting loop. So it's like a playground slide, and you go down. Could you do a full loop-the-loop without falling out of the top, without injuring yourself? Well, actually, I wasn't too sure, and here's the reason. We need a few key components. Firstly, we need potential energy, so we have height at the top of the slide. As we go down the slide, that's converted into kinetic energy, which gives us the velocity, the speed we need. As we enter into the loop, that's converted into centripetal force. That, as you know, as you go around corners, is the force that sticks you into the corner. The centripetal force needs to still be large enough when you get to the top that the effects of gravity don't overweigh the centripetal force, so you don't drop out of the curve. And then hopefully, if you survive all of that, you'll come out neatly at the end. But the key was we couldn't reach 10G going into that first curve. In fact, we shouldn't really even be exceeding 4G. That's the recommended guidelines from the Health and Safety Executive. So that really, I couldn't just do people faster and faster and make it higher and higher. So the way that ride designers go about this is to use a technique called the clothoid loop. Now, the clothoid loop is very simple. It's just two different circles of different diameters. And the way it works safely is that as you come down at top speed and hit the first curve, it's much larger. The diameter is much larger. The centripetal force it creates is much lower. And therefore, the gravitational forces, the G-forces it creates, are also much lower. As you start going up through the loop, as you get high enough and the velocity starts to drop because some of that energy is being turned back into potential energy and a little bit lost through friction, you can then afford to go into a much tighter loop to create a much tighter centripetal force or a much higher centripetal force and whip the rider around the top and then open up to a much wider curve to get them out safely and comfortably. Did I do it? This was our first test run.
Yeah.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that experiment never made it on TV because even though I was successful in my calculations, health and safety deemed it a little bit too dangerous. So it never saw the light of day, so you're probably one of the first people to see that experiment. But if you don't want to rely on centripetal force alone, luckily we have engineers to look after us. One in particular is John Miller, who is an entrepreneur and an engineer in the turn of the 20th century. John Miller has over 100 patents still in existence today, used on roller coasters today. But the one that I'm particularly interested in is the under-friction wheel. That's the wheel that a normal roller coaster with just wheels on the top of a track, if you go around and you run out of speed at the top, the car will just fall off the track. The under-friction wheels are the opposite. They go on the other side of the track, so if you run out of velocity and your centripetal force runs out at the top, the car won't fall out. And if you've done up your safety harness, you'll also won't fall out. So it's a very safe invention. And if you don't want to rely on John Miller's under-friction wheels to keep on the track, and we want to make things even safer, how about we do a loop-the-loop just using visual illusion alone? This is a ride called the Haunted Swing. It appeared around the end of the 19th century. If anybody's been on Hex at Alton Towers, it's a very similar visual illusion to that. Riders would enter a room. They would look around, look like an ordinary room. There was a baby's pram. There was a bookcase with porcelain vases on it. There were books on the shelf. And all the riders would get into a gondola, and then the gondola would very gently start to swing backwards and forwards, getting a little bit higher each time. The riders could feel the forces. They'd know that they were swinging. But unbeknownst to them, the entire room was on another swing. And as they were swinging forwards, the room was swinging in the opposite direction. And the visual illusion made it feel as if the riders were going higher and higher and higher until they believed they were doing a full loop-the-loop. And this ride was actually covered in a science journal in 1895 called Psychological Review. And here's just a snapshot of what they said. The curious and interesting feature, however, was that even though the action was fully understood, as it was in my case, obviously he's a scientist, he couldn't deny, obviously he knew what was going on, as it was in my case, it was impossible to quench the sensations of goneness within. I think he also reported that several men in bowler hats were sick on this ride as well. Now, this is something that's been intriguing me now for the last 2 years. Whereas the Victorians were constrained by mechanical linkages, large theatre sets, they didn't have virtual reality. So now I'm able to create whole rooms and whole environments that only live inside a virtual reality headset. Over the last couple of years, I've been looking at the potential of thrill rides just from two very simple things, a VR headset and a children's playground swing. I've been studying the forces that we feel when we're on a swing. They're very subtle. There are centripetal forces as we swing backwards and forwards. Those centripetal forces change very gradually. They can get anywhere up to 2G, but they're usually around 1.4G to and fro. And I've been thinking about different ways that we might make the body or the mind imagine what the rider is doing. I can make you believe that you're bouncing over rooftops when you're still on a swing. I can make you believe that you're a jellyfish undulating through the sea at the bottom of the water. And I can even make you believe that you're in a very fast wheel that's zooming through the center of a city. And this ride, VR Playground, has been touring around Philadelphia, it's been in Korea, it's been across Europe. This weekend, it's in Preston, if you'd really like to go to Preston this weekend. So, when we think now about the swing and about the potential of what we can do with the swing, just looking at that visual illusion to increase the sensation of thrill, I now start to think about Well, that's only one axis of movement. That's just a rotation around the x-axis. There are actually 6 degrees of motion we can play with. There's rotations about x, around y, around z. We've got movement in x, y, and z. In fact, our bodies are really well tuned to be able to detect these changes in motion. Just look at the inner ear semicircular canal. Our limbs can also detect movement and motion. So if I could do all that with a swing, what if I could create a ride that could move me in all 6 degrees of motion? Now that's where I've been working with my friends at Middlesex University. We've designed a ride so simple, the Middlesex motion platform, the E-platform, which you can see in the center of the hall over there, can move people around in 6 degrees of motion. It's so simple, it can be made by secondary schools in their workshop. The way it works is you have a chair in the center, which is supported by 6 air muscles, and these look like bicycle inner tubes. They're rubber. If you inflate them with air, they get shorter. If you deflate them, they get longer. And by controlling all of the pressures inside those tubes, you can very accurately control the movement of that chair in 6 degrees of motion. And this is a technique called the Stewart platform. It's a very usual design that underpins a lot of simulators. Now, we've been working with computer games manufacturers like No Limits. Anybody who knows No Limits, you can go and design your own roller coaster. You use it, yes. So you know you can go and design your own roller coaster. You can watch it on your computer screen, right? Yeah. But what we're doing now is working with them. You can now ride your own roller coaster. You design it, then put on a virtual reality headset, and with the aid of our motion platform, you feel like you're actually riding that roller coaster. And for me, this is what I'm exploring, because I believe that this is going to be the future, the near future, of roller coasters and theme parks. And this is what I'm particularly interested in. But why talk about the science and art of thrill rides? You can go and try it for yourself. If you go and visit our stand in the centre, go and see Middlesex University, we've got 3 of these rides. I'm going to be there all afternoon, and I'm going to be really happy to answer any of your questions. Come and tell us what you think about it. Thank you.